I might, there we go. The recording has started. Hello everybody, and welcome back to our summer term of CEN seminars. We are very, very pleased today to welcome Professor Silvia Bunge, who is a absolutely fantastic academic in her field. Silvia directs the Building Blocks of Cognition Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, which draws from the fields of cognitive neuroscience, developmental psychology, and education research. Her lab studies the cognitive and neural processes that support reasoning, memory, and goal-directed behavior in humans. And her lab also studies how these processes mature over childhood and adolescence and how they are shaped by education and demographic factors. Professor Bunge seeks to extend her research to understand the individual differences and developmental change in reasoning about real-world phenomena in daily life, as well as in the context of STEM education. And very appropriately, our topic today is reasoning to learn and learning to reason. So I shall sit back and enjoy. Take it away, Silvia.
Thank you so much, Astrid, for having me, and good afternoon to you all. All right, so Astrid already gave a nice overview of what we work on in the lab. Basically, we're interested in reasoning and goal-directed behavior, and we study it from a few different angles. One is looking at the underlying cognitive and neural processes. Another is looking at its development. And then I'm very interested in experience-dependent behavior, experience-dependent higher-order cognition. And in particular, I've looked at how it influences math achievement. Okay, so today I want to first start out by saying something about how I conceptualize executive functions more generally, and Lucy and I were just talking about that. And then I want to talk about relational thinking and argue that it is a candidate executive function. Then I'll talk a little bit about about relational thinking and how it is associated with math performance and its neural basis and development. If I have time, I'll also talk about work on experience-dependent changes in relational thinking. Okay, so we think broadly about executive functions in terms of a continuum of behavior from reactive to proactive. And often we are stimulus driven. That's what's kind of driving our behavior. And then once in a while, we have these control processes that support goal-directed behavior. And so there are various characteristics. It's hard to get to pin down a definition that everybody agrees with, but instead we can talk about characteristics of, like, you know it when you see it, right? So one is that these are cognitive processes or abilities that allow us to focus on, retain, transform, and act on relevant information. There's this set of control process underlies more abstract, more complex thinking and behavior, and that they involve prefrontal cortex, and they change slowly over childhood and adolescence, and they show large individual differences. Okay, so we'll look into that. Okay, and also that they support academic achievement. These are all things that one says about EFs. But this has been kind of a mess in the literature. People talk about various different executive functions, and this is just a subset, and I've just grouped them according to my own conceptualization, right? And so one meta-analysis found 39 different labels for EF processes. There's a ton of tasks out there. Another one found 68, and they did factor analysis, boiled it down to only 18, right? Even though we have various theoretical approaches that have led to the thinking about 3 different functions, and those different ones vary according to the theorist. Okay, and so I love the title of this paper by Jenny Morrison and Fred Morrison and Jenny Grammer. Sorry, I'm still waking up. Conceptual Clutter, Measurement Mayhem. Okay, so what are some relevant distinctions between putative EFs? One is hot versus cool, right? Whether it's at all emotionally or motivationally salient, or just like boring tasks that we give people in the lab. One is real world versus lab-based tasks. One is whether they're externally driven, rule-based, which is the kind of stuff I've done, or stuff where you're making your own choices. And finally, I would argue that one very important one is whether they rely on distinct neural mechanisms or same mechanism but distinct target brain regions. For example, top-down control methods. So I've argued in a recent review that the neural approach could be very helpful for trying to tease apart which EFs are the same and which ones are different. Okay, so I would like to talk about relational thinking, which is the ability to jointly consider two or more mental representations in working memory. Okay, and so these could involve a variety of things. They support reasoning, planning, lots of high-level behaviors. And so, for example, comparing one bird in the hand versus two in the bush, that's keeping two things separate, comparing them. Another one is, of course, analogical reasoning, comparing two sets of relations, right? Memory, is this the thing that I was keeping in mind, etc. Okay, and so from the neural argument, we've found that there are multiple different cognitive tasks that tap into relational reasoning specifically that are neurally dissociable. So here's a very common task that many of you know, matrices task, where you have to identify the relations in the vertical and horizontal, and then find the missing piece. This is a boiled down version that we love called relational matching, where you just have only two relevant dimensions. You don't even have to, learn them yourself, unlike here. And you just say, do these two match in the same way as these two? So the answer is yes, these two match on color, these two match on color, but it involves some abstraction. You can have verbal analogies. You can have transitive inference, right? You're thinking about two different relations and having to integrate them together. And if you look at a meta-analysis, you see a set of regions that come up over and over in these, that come up over and over. And so this is a meta-analytic tool called Neurosynth. And you can type in a particular keyword. I've typed in relational, and you identify all the voxels that are commonly showing up in individual papers that mention the keyword relational, okay? And in red are the ones that are much more likely to be presented in a table of coordinates for papers that include the term relational versus do not include that term. And this is a meta-analysis of over 14,000 studies and like 1,100 psychological terms. And shown in gray are the papers that include the term relational, but not more so than other terms, right? And you see since you guys are in the UK, you see the multiple demand network essentially here. So, and my lab has done a lot of research on this rostrolateral area of the brain, and we now have a grant to look much more deeply into it mechanistically, but I'm not going to talk about that today. All right. So relational thinking improves over childhood. It's highly variable. So we had one study showing that it kind of plateaued till around age 12. And this was using Raven's progressive matrices. And this is a more recent study where we collaborated with folks at UCSF that involved a large number of kids. And we used that pared down relational matching task. And this is the accuracy and response times. And you see this massive spread across grades 4, 6, and 8, but you also see some maturation, essentially, both in RTs and accuracy. Okay, and so we've argued that there's a lot of research showing that reasoning writ large is associated with various aspects of math, and that it in fact predicts the growth of math. But that's using the more complex kinds of reasoning tasks that include multiple executive functions. And so we've argued that even when you pare it down to these kinds of relational matching tasks where you have first order and second order relations, that's the relations among relations, that you can see that at various ages that as math develops, that math develops as a function of how far along you are in terms of being able to process relations. And so early on in childhood, it could be very, very basic computations, and then you can get into fractions, proportions, up to pre-algebra and algebra. So that's the hypothesis. Okay, and so I'm interested in fractions in particular. I've done a few studies on that, both behaviorally and with eye tracking, because first of all, it's common stumbling block, at least here in the United States for kids. And we know that it's a very strong predictor of learning of algebra. And here in the US, algebra is a gatekeeper, not only for going on in STEM, but also for even just finishing high school and getting to go on into higher ed. And so there's a lot of research looking at relationships between executive functions and fraction knowledge. And it's also inherently relational, right? So in two ways. One is you have to look at the relationships between the numerator and denominator. One is that you have to be able to flexibly map all these different representations of fractions to one another. And so our goal is to tease apart the contributions of different EFs and relational thinking to fractions. Okay. So this, in that large study, we had also math fluency. So this is basic one digit addition, subtraction, multiplication. We had a fractions task that I'll just show you, and then canonical EF and relational thinking. So this is what it looked like. This is a fraction comparison task. You had to say which of these was larger. And then we had various predictors. So the addition, subtraction, multiplication, working memory, and then 3 interference suppression, 3 response inhibition, 3 cognitive flexibility tasks, and then our basic relational matching task. And so what we found was, just first of all, if you look at how all these cognitive predictors are associated with math fluency, relational thinking was at least as good as a predictor as any one of the other 10 cognitive tasks. That's not what we're looking at here, though. We're interested in the fraction comparison. And it was the best predictor of the fraction task at all grades, okay? And almost as strong as this math task, actually. And if you put all of this into a model, with math fluency and with these 3 EF factors, it actually explained additional variance. So it's something that we need to consider more. And as of right now, I've found that the executive function literature and the reasoning literature are very much separate, and I want to bring in the relational piece as I want to bring it into the pantheon of executive functions, shall we say. Okay, so switching gears, this is a much larger study that we've done looking at the neural basis of reasoning development. This was in around 200 kids, I would say. And we're interested in various aspects of both anatomy and function. I'm only going to talk about a little bit about one study that came out of this large endeavor. So we've got local anatomy, so you can look at individual brain regions and how cortical thickness is changing and how that correlates with reasoning. We've got long-range anatomy, so we've looked at long-range white matter tracts. And then in terms of function, locally, we've looked at functional selectivity when you're performing this relational matching task. And we've looked at long-range functions of functional connectivity between regions based on coupled activation, coupled bold activation over time. And we've looked at how each of these is related to reasoning. Okay, so in this is a pooled study across not only ours, but 2 others as well. And this is matrix reasoning performance, and you can see that it's consistent with what we found before, which is that on this kind of task, you see leveling off around age 12-ish, but tons of individual variability. And you can see, some 7-year-olds who are on par or even higher than some teenagers, and we're interested in that as well. Okay, so a few key findings. So first is, if we're looking at functional connectivity between regions in prefrontal and parietal cortices, we can see that not only cross-sectionally, but also longitudinally, this degree of coupling is actually associated with better reasoning, in particular, relative to some other lower level cognitive functions. And in particular, in the left hemisphere, we find that increased coupling between these parietal and rostrolateral prefrontal regions is the best predictor of reasoning and reasoning growth over time, even controlling for age. Okay. And then a question we had is whether these changes in functional connectivity could be driven by changes in white matter. And so here what we have is a set of white matter tracks that we've identified probabilistically between a set of areas that have been implicated in reasoning, so in dorsolateral and rostrolateral and several parietal areas. So we've just identified those probable tracts and pulled out white matter measures to look at a measure of white matter coherence. Okay, and so basically we do find changes over childhood in this lateral frontoparietal white matter microstructure, and it's correlated cross-sectionally with reasoning performance. And also we find that it predicts the growth of functional connectivity as well as reasoning over the next 1.5 years. So I'm not going into detail about this essentially, but basically the white matter is predicting the changes in functional coupling as well as changes in performance here. So we think that early scaffolding of the white matter is very important later on. And if I have a chance to talk about it, we have research in adults looking at training, and we do find that we can change both white matter and functional connectivity. All right, so, we think that relational thinking is an executive function because it is one form of transformation of information that's in working memory. It does underlie reasoning as well as I talked about, decision-making, planning. It is mediated by brain networks that involve PFC, and it improves slowly, shows large individual differences, and supports academic achievement. So, in the US, we have an expression that you may or may not have. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And so that's the thesis. Okay, and so we think there might be some implications for pedagogy here. So we think children are capable of relational thinking, even as young as age 6 and even younger, but there is still a lot of development that's happening. And, some people would argue that very young kids already can do relational thinking, and all they're lacking is knowledge, like domain knowledge, for example, in terms of analogical reasoning. And I would argue that that's not true. You not only need domain knowledge, but you also see strengthening of these very basic skills, even when there's no knowledge at play, as in this very abstract task that involves only colors and shapes. Okay, but I think that students might need instructional support. And so there's, various ways that people have tried to go about this. We had one study that didn't work out so well, where we were looking at if you emphasize the relational aspects of graphs, that could potentially improve understanding of graphs because of the inherently relational nature of various aspects of graphs. Unfortunately, our control condition did just as well as improving performance. So that's the jury's still out on that. And I also have an inkling that, in young kids who are still learning to relate to pieces of information, that could be helpful for scaffolding things like which of these sets has more, which then could scaffold all the rest of math. Okay, so that's actually the first part of what I wanted to talk with you about. And I do then have time to tell you about the very last piece. So I have clearly pared down this talk quite a lot, and will therefore have a lot of time for Q&A. Okay, so we were looking for some kind of real world scenario in which people might be practicing their relational thinking. And we settled on this law school admission test, which something like 100,000 adults take every year to get into law school. And there are various ways in which people prepare for them. People will shell out thousands of dollars to prepare. So they're highly motivated to learn. And there are many ways to do that. And so does this change them, at least over the short term? The law school admission test itself isn't predictive of long-term performance in law school. And that's not why we used it whatsoever. It's just, proof of concept that what you do can change your reasoning, even temporarily. So just to give you an example, there are 3 sections of the LSAT. One is logical reasoning, another one is, I think, called analogical reasoning, and the third one is reading comprehension. So 2/3 of the task are focused on reasoning. And this is a sample logical reasoning problem where you get some sort of premise here. And then this is actually a flawed argument. And then you have a bunch of other premises involving completely different domain knowledge. You have to figure out which one has the same kind of flawed reasoning. One would hope that lawyers would be able to follow these kinds of problems, certainly. But they are relational, just not in a way that we've ever studied before. Then here's an analytical reasoning problem. So you have a set of rules that are governing when this cleaning crew should work. So these are different things that you have to keep in mind, that you have to integrate in order to figure out to make this inference. So just another kind of example, again, very different from the kinds of reasoning problems that are visuospatial and largely domain independent. Okay, and so what do we find? We did 2 studies. The first one was around 100 hours. We just recruited people who had signed up for one of these law school test preps that's thousands of dollars, versus people who were planning to go to law school in the future but hadn't yet started. And that it was on the entire LSAT. And so we found improvement on this one like transitive inference task where you have to figure out which of these two is heavier by looking, by comparing sets of balls here. While people were performing this task, what we saw was generally just a decrease in prefrontal activation. They performed more accurately, and they showed decrease in activation of a region that's active whenever you're doing any kind of difficult task. We also looked at white matter, and we saw a set of areas that showed changes in this microstructure based on diffusion properties, both all along left prefrontal as well as right parietal and corpus callosum. And again, these are probably very short-term changes in white matter, and we don't actually know what are the underlying neural mechanisms or cellular mechanisms, rather. Could be myelination, could be something else. And then finally, when we looked at functional connectivity, we had these broad regions of interest based on areas that have been implicated in reasoning before, and we counted up the number of functional connections that changed. We showed increased connectivity between an area and one or more other areas. And much of it was in the left hemisphere, which we've seen over and over in our studies in terms of regions that are most reliably implicated in reasoning. So that was very interesting. But this is just overall law school prep versus this passive control. And so we did a follow-up study, and this is much more focused, and we recruited people who weren't actually currently studying for the test, and we compared 2 different subcomponents. And so they were doing either 33 hours of one or the other. And as I mentioned, this is one of the analytical reasoning problems. And we had 4 transfer tasks to other aspects of reasoning, and you can hopefully appreciate how very different they are from what people actually did during training. And so they improved on that. And then we also looked at their eye gaze patterns when they were doing that, the ball transfer inference task. And we found that when they were looking at individual relations, they looked at them more briefly, which means they were more efficient at just extracting the relational information. That was the biggest insight that we had from there. So yeah, lots of different ways of triangulating on this problem, showing that you can, at least over the short term in adults, show increases in reasoning and its underlying neural substrates. However, we don't know, we haven't managed to get funding to look at intensive training in healthy or atypically developing children. Believe me, we've tried to get funding for that. Instead, what we've looked at general schooling effects. We reviewed what's out there in the literature that's been there for decades, actually. But it would be nice to know more than just the fact that schooling as a whole sharpens your ability to reason. Okay, and so this is the acknowledgments for the second part of the study. Alison Mackey has been a powerhouse in this work on plasticity. She has her own lab now at the University of Pennsylvania. And Belen she's gone over to the dark side. She's a data scientist now, but amazing at her job as well. And that's actually all that I have for you today. So plenty of time for questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sylvia. You were very concerned about running over time, but we've ended up with lots and lots of time for discussion, which we love our discussion and our Q&A here at the CEN. So that is brilliant. So we've already got a few specific questions about aspects of your talk in the chat. So I think we will start there. So
Sure.
Marsha asks,
Yeah.
so she says, great talk to begin with. Thank you. And this is in reference to the first part of your talk. So which white matter tracts specifically did you look at in that first sort of study you presented?
Oh, this one right here, right? Yeah. Is
I
that
think
right?
it was that one. I think it was that one. Marsha, if we're wrong, please let us know. But I think it was that one, yes.
Yeah. So we essentially were um, these are all, we think, different aspects of the superior longitudinal fasciculus in terms of the frontal ones. We looked at, okay, here's what we did. We looked at frontoparietal within hemisphere. We looked at frontal across hemispheres and parietal across hemispheres. And by far the best predictor of reasoning was frontoparietal, uh, both the ones from dorsolateral to parietal and rostrolateral to parietal, just those four combinations, and particularly in the left hemisphere. And we think that these are all just running through the superior longitudinal fasciculus. We did constrain it in that way, I believe, actually. So does that help, Marcia? Anyway,
She asks IFOF and ILF.
we I don't think that we looked at either of those. I don't think we were, I think that we believed that all of these would pass through the superior longitudinal fasciculus, but just because those other ones, as far as I understand, don't get to these areas of parietal, but I'm happy to be corrected if that's incorrect. Okay.
Marsha, does that answer your question? If you have any follow-up, we will come back to that. That's absolutely fine. Yes, she says, thank you. Brilliant. Thank you. So the next question is from Anne, who is interested in the study on changes in adults.
Mhm.
Could you provide more details or a reference? Was there a
Oh,
paper
sure.
reference on it?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm going to page through. So we actually published a bunch of papers on this. Let me see. Um, my screen is very full right here. I can't see what you are able to see. Yeah,
Yeah, we can see the
I'm
whole
happy.
screen.
Oh, yeah, I know, but I don't know what I put on the screen. Okay, so we
Oh,
have a bunch of papers, one on the fMRI, one on the DTI, and one on the functional connectivity.
mm,
And I'm happy to send those along later. And then the other one was published in this Nature Partner journal, Science of Learning. So yeah, happy to send those along.
great. Thank you. Anne has a follow-up. What was the age range?
Oh, that's a good question. This was probably something like 21 to 25, something along those lines.
Mm. So Jessica has a question about this as well, which is similar to a question I was sort of going to ask, but we'll see. Maybe mine was a bit different. So she says, building on Annie's question, could you discuss more about the implications or findings for higher education?
Yeah, I have one paper that kind of steps back from that specifically, but I think is very interesting. So a lot of studies that show that cognitive functioning, including reasoning, but also executive functioning, that it peaks around age 21-ish, early 20s, and then it starts this slow, gradual descent, right? Very depressing stuff. But I was interested in whether the age at peak cognitive functioning actually depends on when you finish your schooling. Because during school, during higher ed, you are challenged in multiple different ways, right? In ways that you may or may not be challenged later on, depending on the kind of career you choose, right? And so we had this study where we looked at across 1,000 participants, or more than 1,000. We put people into different buckets of level of education: didn't complete high school, completed college, completed master's, or or professional degree, or PhD. And what we found is within those buckets, we looked at the age of peak performance, and this was cross-sectional, just like at what point, at what age do we see best performance for people who did not complete high school, et cetera, for the different levels of education. And what we find really maps on quite dramatically to those when you finish education. So around age 18 if you finished high school, then 21 if you finished college, then like 23 or something for master's professional. I'm kind of making this up. And then around like 25 to 30 if you got your PhD. Interestingly, then once you get into the descent, so regardless of your sort of baseline reasoning abilities, which do vary across people, we're focused on the peak. But when you get beyond that peak at whatever age it is, it's actually parallel slopes. But even at age 65 or something, someone with a PhD is on par with someone who didn't finish high school. Anyway, long way to say, and that was a composite of reasoning and various other cognitive measures, and the effect was strongest for the reasoning measure. Do we have any other kinds of evidence directly? I don't think so. I've been interested in the research that's been done on Richard Nisbet has done some cool work looking at what kinds of reasoning improve depending on what major you've had in college. So they found that psychology majors improve in probabilistic thinking, and then some others improved in other kinds of reasoning. And so that I think is the most kind of compelling work. So Dick Nisbet, and then obviously the Flynn effect, I think is very interesting. So if I think about my own kind of pedagogy, I'm not interested in cramming facts into students, especially now with generative AI being able to, give them all the facts they need. But really all my tests focus on critical thinking, essentially making inferences based on just bits of information I give them. So that's, I would hope that people are all just finding ways to embed various reasoning skills into the domain knowledge. I do not believe that abstract kill and drill computerized training on these very abstract tasks is going to be at all helpful. I think the work on working memory training has been kind of disappointing on that front in terms of far transfer to what people actually need to do. It's more, I think, about designing your curriculum in such a way that it's mindful of how you can be embedding executive functions, including relational thinking, into them. Hope that helps.
That's a brilliant answer. I was just ferociously typing, trying to get everything you were saying down. So it's really interesting. Anne actually has one more follow-up, which is, do you know if anyone has done this work on older learners, like middle or late adulthood?
So there's this one really cool study out of Germany, out of Berlin, called the Cogito study, where they trained like 100 adults, but it wasn't just reasoning, it was multiple cognitive abilities, and they did see improvements with that. So I haven't seen anything more specific than that.
Thank you. I'll just jump in there because I had a question about sort of working with adults based on what you said. Because obviously reasoning is so important for our sort of daily life, for, determining what's a fact, what's fiction, what's real, what's not. And I think there's a big area of research now on, resisting disinformation which I think, relies on these kinds of reasoning skills. And again, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, is there anything that adults could be working on in that area to try and, work on this?
Yeah, and so I taught a class that's not exactly related to that, but it was
Mm,
on motivated reasoning and how just like our logic just flies out the window based on whatever we believe in our gut to be true. But and then I tried to get a grant to study motivated reasoning and how we could combat that, especially in I was interested in middle childhood as a sweet spot where you're starting to learn something about the world, and your reasoning skills are, kind of pretty good actually. So that seemed like a good time to intervene. Um, how you can combat it, I mean, I think it has to be done directly. Again, I don't think that any kind of like abstract training is going to help with that whatsoever. So I think I have seen I was talking with somebody who just in her high school class, I think it was a high school history class actually, she just points out different ways, different things in the media that look wrong, where they have to think more deeply about them. But I don't have anything beyond that to say. Um, yeah, I think it's very, very, very important, both in high school and college, to
yeah.
just be pointing out different ways to fact check, etc.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'll just ask a quick follow-up if you don't mind, before I move on, because it sort of touches upon, if if you haven't got those kind of basic skills that you've sort of developed from a young age, it can be really difficult. And you discussed the LSAT, which is obviously for older learners, but we actually have a test here in the UK with the 11 plus, which some places stop using, some places still use, and it actually contains tests of reasoning. So I think there's definitely an interest here in the UK in teaching children reasoning skills in primary school. And again, I guess I was just wondering about any methods, suggestions you have for instilling some of these basic skills from a young age in a sort of a practical sense for teachers.
Yeah, there's one curriculum that I was very interested in studying here called Amplify
Mm,
that's all about science, various aspects of science from the microbiome to climate change. That's very much focused on critical thinking at that age range, and from middle school through high school. And I wanted to see whether, going backwards, whether that program, as opposed to some of the others that are more just like, regurgitation, whether they are themselves honing reasoning skills. Because then you could work backward and say, okay, what are the key ingredients of these programs that could be helpful? Um,
mm,
but yeah, beyond that, I don't know. And I did some of these training studies before, where I ultimately, got disillusioned. I got off the bandwagon of just like
mm.
cognitive psychologists, cognitive scientists taking our tasks and trying to just port them over to education. I got disillusioned with that and decided, no, I have to learn from educators. I have to see what they're doing and what's the best of that and help evaluate that.
Amazing. I think that's a great message, Sylvia. Thank you. I'm aware that there's more questions in the chat, but I think I'll go to Jusha, seeing as you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to describe it in a little bit more detail than I could put in a chat, so that's why I raised my hand. So I've been studying working memory and its development for a very long time, and I'm always really frustrated and kind of been trying to work on how to break out this view of working memory, which mostly focuses on storage and like how many items can kids remember backwards, forwards, and so on, and not on the manipulation part, which it's always in the definition, but we don't really focus on the what it means to manipulate information in our working memory. And I know that I don't mean to be like uh, challenging that relational thinking is its own executive function, but how do you see the overlap between relational thinking, like analogical thinking, the way you describe, which I 100% agree is super important, and the work that you've shown is very convincing. But in what way is it like essentially overlapping with what we used to call like manipulation in working memory? And I don't really think that, if just to like one last asterisk, is just because the work that you do is maybe in a context you can look at the items, so in a sense you don't have to, they don't have to be in your memory. To me, that doesn't seem to be the crucial difference. It's about the representation. So if you're using manipulating representations, whether they're still visible or they're in your head, isn't that just working memory manipulation?
Yeah, it's a good
And
point. I think they both rely on working memory as essentially. I mean, even if something's on the screen. But I do think they're different, and I came to that conclusion from the neural data, actually. I've done work on the development of working memory manipulation. I had a study on that. And it really is about dorsolateral prefrontal as well as parietal cortex. And that ability to maintain that is improving over childhood and adolescence. But it's very much a more posterior part of prefrontal cortex than this region associated with relational thinking. And some of these relational thinking tasks that I've studied involve literally just two items, like literally, well, three items, just thinking, is it the case that the relational term uses accurately describes the relationship between a writer and a pen, for example, like that, and everything's on the screen right there. And these manipulation tasks, so for example, reordering a set of items in working memory, those are very complicated, but they rely on different brain regions, overlapping, but not totally overlapping from what we see. So that's my thinking is just even just very simply keeping two things in mind, but keeping them separate.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Silvia. Again, I'm sorry I'm jumping around between the questions, but I'm trying to group topics together. So there's a question, if you could say more about the association between some of these different skills, so these reasoning skills, working memory capacity, and then measures of cognitive flexibility. Could you say a bit more about those associations?
Yeah. So I don't have it here, but in that study with the 10 different, let me see if I can get back to it, with the 10 different executive function tasks and the one measure of relational thinking. Sorry, I should probably just,
That's okay.
yeah, this one here. So we did look at the cross correlations between each of the 10 tasks. And they all were correlated with one another at around maybe 0.3. So I do think that there are important distinctions between them. And then relational thinking was also correlated with each of these at around 0.3. So
Great,
I don't know if
thank
that
you.
helps, but I do think that it's separable. And again, I make that argument really
Yeah.
based on the neural data. And I have that in my most recent Mind, Brain, and Education 2024 study or paper, as well as this paper here is not on about the neural basis, but it's this one.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and Anne says yes, makes sense as well. So I'm now going to come to Professor James Booth. Thank you so much for your question, and I really hope that I relay it well. If you'd like to speak as well, that's absolutely fine. So James says, fantastic talk. Many argue that achievement IQ discrepancy, for example, matrices of nonverbal reasoning, should not be used to diagnose learning disabilities. However, some studies show that there is an association between nonverbal reasoning and achievement. Should we continue not to use discrepancy between achievement and IQ to diagnose reading disabilities?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't feel confident enough to talk about reading disabilities per se.
Mm,
I've noticed a bunch of studies where you control for IQ. First of all, I hate the term IQ, but secondly, that you control for it, which I don't think makes sense because IQ is a measure that relies on multiple cognitive abilities that themselves support um, things like reading, etc. And so, to my mind, you're throwing out some of the baby with the bathwater. But I can understand the logic of saying, okay, all these cognitive functions, those are in place, and yet this child has a reading disability, meaning there is something over and above those basic cognitive abilities that that is relevant. So I could see, I don't, condone controlling for something, but I can see the interest in looking at that discrepancy.
Yeah, because I think one of the definitions of dyslexia is that, it's reading difficulty without cognitive impairment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So I totally understand your point there. So James had one more question, which was, why is nonverbal reasoning related to individual differences in reading? What do you think is the cognitive mechanism there?
Yeah. So nonverbal reasoning, so I will say that the tests that are used, like matrices, it does involve not only relational thinking, but also some interference suppression, some working memory.
Mhm.
It's all of that. And so the question is, how much of that is actually the relational piece? And I don't think that we know. This study could be one way that one could get at it because it also has a bunch of reading tasks in it as well. But for me, I have a hammer, which is relational thinking, and everything looks like a nail. But for me, reading is very much relational. Uh, you know, um, you do have to keep track of the relations within and between sentences, between agents and and actions and outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
for me, it makes perfect sense. Um, and I will go back to that law school test, which was all verbal and involved a lot of reading and was affected the relational thinking tasks.
Thank you, Sylvia. James says thanks as well. So there's a couple of really interesting well, there's three. I'm holding on to one to the end because I think it's a kind of a broad level question. Maybe I'll go to Ali next, who asks, how is relational thinking distinguished from conceptual thinking? The ability to identify patterns or connections between situations that are not obviously related. Have you come across that term before?
So I haven't come across that term. If that is, if that's involving very concrete kinds of situations, um, then I can see how this relational thinking, which we think is domain general, and we're currently testing that, whether it could absolutely be important for conceptual thinking. Um, yeah,
So
I,
you're saying you think it's sort of the relational thinking is almost
would
a
be a
basis
component,
for
would
the component.
necessary but not sufficient for conceptual thinking, I would say, because yeah, as you're saying, to be able to grasp, um, the gist of a complex situation, I think that you do, to notice relationships between situations, I think is highly relational for sure.
Really interesting. Thank you, Sylvia. So Catherine asks, well, she says, thank you for your talk. Have you done any work on neural synchrony and how children learn in naturalistic settings with and from each other and adults? Have you looked at that?
I have not, and I'd be interested in hearing what you think that would bring to
Mhm.
this work. Yeah.
Great. Catherine, if you've got any thoughts, please feel free to share them. So the question I've been holding on to is from Andrea, who says, thank you very much for the great talk. I would like to know whether you've had any opportunity to share these ideas with policymakers, and if so, how did it go?
Mhm. Hi, Andrea, first of all. I have not talked about this specifically with policymakers. I've talked more with them about just impacts of low socioeconomic status on, educational opportunities and achievement and brain development, but we've never gotten around to talking about this.
Good to know. Thank you. So we've got a few minutes left. So if we have any further questions, please pop them in. I've got one sort of final big picture question myself as well. Really going back to, for researchers, we're often breaking EF down into all these specific skills and, all these little buckets. And whereas for, teachers, EF is it's kind of a catch-all, for behavior regulation and reasoning and such. And I guess if you had to kind of sum up in a key message aimed at teachers, what do you think should be the takeaway from this for teachers, or the key message?
Yeah, I mean, I think for teachers, um, I do believe it's helpful to just conceptualize it all together. I'm thinking as I speak, do I really believe that? Because all of this is interrelated, right? We like to separate them, but for example, to switch between rules, you do have to inhibit impulses. You do have to ignore irrelevant information. Um, uh, you know, um, all of this relates to working memory. None of this works without working memory.
Mm,
Relational thinking, as we were talking about, has some commonalities with say working relational thinking and working memory manipulation have some commonalities. All of this works together. None of it is possible without the others, right? Do educators need to get into the intricacies of all this? No, I don't think so. I think they just need to be thinking about opportunities where there is irrelevant information that needs to be ignored. Um, and just for example, in fractions, making sure that there are the kinds of problems that that lure people into picking the wrong answer. That I know that there's been some work on this. Bob Siegler, I believe, has looked at textbooks and showing that people can answer these problems without actually understanding because there hasn't been any thought put into the kinds of examples that are given. So ways to bake those control processes in if they have a general understanding of what those are. Yeah, and then there's work by Lindsay Richland and others looking at how you can scaffold understanding in STEM through analogical reasoning, for example, by putting things side by side, like the sun and the planets and atoms and electrons, nuclei and electrons, et cetera, putting them side by side to emphasize the relationships between them. So yeah, so that's on the curriculum development side. But basically, I think that it would be interesting to know whether giving one excellent analogy for a problem is the best way to go, or whether you can actually give kids several different analogies and get them to discuss why they fall apart or don't fall apart. And I'll give one example, and that is genes. Is it best to consider genes as being a recipe book, or is it best to think of them as the blueprint for a house? And so I can't remember the name of the author who Dawkins actually. He was saying it's best to think of it as a recipe because a recipe is kind of holistic, it's kind of imprecise, and it's a combination of all these ingredients that produce the outcome. Whereas a blueprint, it suggests a one-to-one mapping between a part of the genetic code and a particular part of the plan. Like you wipe out this gene and you're going to wipe out this bathroom on the third floor. And it's not at all like that. And I think that could be really interesting, just and a way to draw in relational thinking to scaffold, to more precisely hone in on abstract concepts.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got jumping off of that, we've got one more question in the chat, and I think that will be our last question because we've really put you through the mill, Silvia, very early in the morning for you there as well. So we really appreciate all the discussion. But I think before I ask this, I'll sort of contextualize it because you mentioned obviously during your talk that you don't believe, these really ultra targeted EF interventions are the way to go. But then I've also heard it suggested that, don't bother doing anything with EF, just do normal activities and the EF will sort of develop anyway just by doing sort of normal teaching and learning, essentially. So with that sort of context in mind, you've got all the way from really, really targeted to do nothing, essentially, in the sort of approaches. Anne asks if you have any recommendations for effective instructional strategies. For example, she says it sounds like maybe interleaving might be a good strategy.
Oh, it's a really great question. I have learned over time that I don't have specific strategy. I really think that educators have a much better sense of what they should be doing than I do. I think all we can really offer is diagnostic tools to see if we're getting kids to where they need to be, or by what by what mechanism learning is occurring and where does it fall short. So yeah, I do think we just need to be mindful of the curriculum, the way things are being taught, and then the rest will, I think, take care of, the rest will, I think, take care of itself. I don't,
Brilliant.
yeah, I don't think we should be just interleaving this sort of kill and drill approach with the curriculum.
That's great. No, thank you so much, Silvia. Again, really, really appreciate your time. Really, really appreciate all this discussion, this fantastic idea sharing you've done with us. And I think we will wrap it up there. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today, and
A
hopefully
great
see.
question. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Sylvia. I think it was great that you, I did tell you in advance that we do have a lot of discussion here. So I think it was a good thing that your talk was
Wonderful.
left a lot of room for that. So no, thank you so much. And yeah, see you all for the next CN seminar. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Astrid.